So I'd like to talk today, give you a little bit of context, maybe some national context on initiatives that both Second Nature is working on, but then hopefully broader contextually how sustainability is moving, the directions it's moving nationally. And I'd like to start with a little bit of the why now, why sustainability now, and then think about specifically actions that we're taking to mature sustainability as a movement and then sustainability initiatives in higher ed, because we're at kind of this interesting point that I'll get to in a second. I first want to talk about, just quick background. I was a carpenter in Asheville, North Carolina for a number of years, and this was a very kind of a formative time for me. We built, this literally was one of the buildings that we built. Huge residential construction in the middle of beautiful Appalachian Blue Ridge Mountains. And we were really struck at the time, I was really struck at the time with how both impactful the footprint of our operations were, but then also, you know, the resources needed to maintain and construct the building itself. And so I was always kind of faced and struck with this interface between human and natural systems. That's been a part of my interest for decades. And then now I'm up in Boston and I realized that you guys have been at this for a long time, and this was actually in March, the cover of the Boston Globe. This guy had found a way to progressively move green building in another direction. I don't know how he pulled that off, but the fact that the fact that it was March and we still had this much snow was shocking for someone who'd lived in the South for 10 years. The context here is really about our relationship with things that aren't us. And it's important to understand with sustainability that it is a very human-centric enterprise. So the Earth has been going through a variety of oscillations year after year, decade after decade, and for really millions and billions of years, there's been massive changes in the Earth systems. But it's really both our impact and our response to that impact. How can we survive as a species that gets us to this point where we are today, where now, rather than thinking about a separation between us and the environment, we really need to be thinking about these things as integrated, or in some ways coupled. People use the term coupled human and natural systems. This is very much the state of the ecological world now, is to think about humans not as separate from nature, but humans as integral into the natural process. And Wendell Berry, probably some Wendell Berry fans in the room, but he foreshadowed this in some of his writings when he talked about this idea, whenever you separate ourselves, whenever you use the term environment to describe something that surrounds you, you're making this fundamental distinction between it and ourselves. And we've really done that. I mean, we've really done that in a variety of ways, not just with our construction practices, but with the psyche, the way we operate, the way that we even talk about our cities, for example. You know, I lived in Indianapolis for years, and everyone would talk about going to, if they were going to the environment, it would be somewhere other than Indianapolis. It would be in Brown County in southern Indiana, or it would be in Yosemite, or it would be in whatever place they went that wasn't where people were. And I think we really realize now that that's fundamentally a wrong way of thinking. It's actually probably a moral element to that. And it's not something that's really helpful for progress. If we think of ourselves as just the problem, we're going to run into all sorts of future issues which we've already created for ourselves. So we really need to integrate our thinking around ourselves as both a major driver of the system and a major part of what the solution could look like. So the idea is no longer we would look at this as here's where humans are, here's where non-humans are, but we're all part of the same system. And so just to get into the why a little bit, and I'm not going to talk so much about the climate science. Many of you in the room probably know more about this than I do. I'm an ecologist, so I don't have a background in climate science in particular. But I would just say reference the National Climate Assessment, which is now, if you look down at this bottom corner, you can see this website. It's a great, actually a new way that the National Climate Assessment has been presented to the public. It was a new way that all the data was collected, as well as a new way that the data was presented. And so it's very dynamic, it's very customizable. If you want to teach students or teach your classes or somehow get information back to people referencing the National Climate Assessment site is very helpful. Just a couple things to point out. One is, and this will probably be increasing as the political climate kind of ramps up around the elections, but the role of science is not one of figuring out 100% what do we absolutely know. It's about generating new knowledge filled with uncertainty in a world especially filled with uncertainty. But what we do know as we increase that science is that, so here you're looking at different bands of models. So the green band is a model that shows global temperature change with natural factors. And then you have global temperature change with natural and human factors. And then the black line is actual data. Okay, so what you can see is that the actual data reflects our models increasingly better and better. And the models are built on that actual data. So the verification process is happening, and we're understanding that we're actually doing a better and better job of understanding how this global temperature change is happening. But this is an ongoing and dynamic process. Science, that's the nature of science, it's inquisitive, it's asking questions. And ultimately, it results in better answers as we challenge our paradigms. So we're seeing this happen. A couple of, I think, interesting things to note from National Climate Assessment. They talk about water, they talk about indicators. The one thing that's interesting about water in particular, I was just out in California last week, and it was in Southern California, and of course they're like in the middle of this massive, epic drought. Actually, it's not an epic drought, it's a part of their natural cycle. But the demand side, so the drought conditions are not unnatural, but the amount of demand on that water is increasing due to human conditions, the human demand that we have on it. But what's also interesting about this is, so this is water supply stress index. This tells you how much stress will there be on the water supply in the future. And there are places, so here I was in Georgia, and there are places that traditionally have been very wet, and water supply has never been an issue. And now under these climate scenarios, we're starting to see supply stress overlaid with human activity that really creates future problems. So it's not just about climate conditions increasing temperature or reducing sea ice or raising sea levels. It's actually this combination of natural factors and human factors that we have to pay attention to. And, the Northeast, we're good, right? No water supply issues for us. Well, this would not take a whole lot to turn into a situation like this, which ultimately can turn into a situation like this. And so we have to be careful to not get content with our current consumption patterns in order to see that there is limitations to that, particularly around water. Water is going to be a huge issue, and water availability in particular is going to be a huge issue when we overlay it with our activities. Last thing I'll mention, many of you have probably heard in the news today even, there are all sorts of different types of constituencies that are interested in this subject in climate for all kinds of reasons. The Pope is going to develop this paper that will be released this summer to talk about particularly climate as it affects different, probably poor populations. And so the impacts, and the president just recently talked about climate change and human health. So all these different connections that are being made socially amongst not just the physical impacts of climate more generally and the general population, but particular subpopulations within, globally, that we need to pay attention to being particularly vulnerable to these situations. And so it's actually a great opportunity to engage with and have dialogue with potentially people who have not typically thought the same way about you as a person or your organization or your institution for a long time. So this can bring people together in unique ways. So that's somewhat of the why from a physical, social, and then there's this kind of an interesting why from a higher ed perspective. So why is higher ed particularly important in our sustainability dialogue globally? I'm just going to leave this picture up so everyone starts to get mesmerized by the line. This is a researcher who is looking at nanotechnology. So at a fundamental, he's doing basic science around the properties of light using small tubes. And so why higher ed? One of the fundamental reasons of why higher ed is knowledge generation, right? We create knowledge within our universities. And in some ways, we create different types of knowledge. Some ways it's like this. It's fundamental knowledge that as a market, there's a lot of vendors on the outside. There's no really apparent market application for understanding some of the optics of light. It's a hope that eventually we'll get there, but fundamentally, a lot of the knowledge generation that's happening at universities doesn't have a direct application in the market. And we have to recognize that as a unique factor of what makes higher ed important as it relates to sustainability. There's this fundamental knowledge generation that's happening there. And then there's more of the traditional applied knowledge generation that's happening at universities. Anybody know what these things are? Take a guess. There actually are wrong answers, so you could be wrong. So this is cow manure, obviously. And this researcher is figuring out ways in which using anaerobic processes that they can generate bioenergy out of cow manure in particular. So how this is done is very much a direct application towards some problem that they're looking to solve. And a lot of us in the sustainability field are pragmatists. Philosophically, we're pragmatists. We want to figure out solutions to problems, and that's how we would measure success, is how well we're figuring out those solutions. Both of those things happen with knowledge generation in higher ed. We're generating knowledge for the sake of knowledge, understanding more just about how the world works, and then we're also generating knowledge to apply that knowledge. And this is a really critical area to bring together the fundamental researchers with applied researchers is in some ways a great opportunity for sustainability to integrate those two. I will say two things here about knowledge generation. One is these are isolated pictures of single people, and that never happens. At universities, you have to well, it doesn't never happen, right? It does happen, but there's always teams of graduate students behind the scenes working on this. And if you look at so some economists did a survey of the most important breakthroughs that happen scientifically, and they found that if you had interdisciplinary teams of researchers, you were 37% more likely to have one of those breakthrough technologies happen, or breakthrough knowledges happen. So it's very important to think about, and it's something we're predisposed to as sustainability folks, is this interdisciplinarity. But it also, interdisciplinary presumes disciplinarity, right? We have to know what we're talking about in order to come together as disciplines. And so in some ways, this applied research with teams of different types of people is a really huge opportunity, again, to orient around sustainability and knowledge generation. So it happens with multiple types of people, and it happens with different types of disciplines. So that's part of the why of higher ed. Another part of the why of higher ed is knowledge curation. So knowledge generation and knowledge curation. And this is what we typically call teaching. So we teach and learn as students in a variety of ways. You teach directly from your professors. You sit in the class and there's knowledge that hopefully is creatively being presented to you that is engaging, and you learn. You acquire that knowledge directly. And then there's other ways that this applies to sustainability particularly. So classes can actually be designed and are being designed to incorporate sustainability practices. So this is a community college that is, I think the class is named something like Introduction to Small Wind Turbine Construction or something like that. It's explicitly about this, how do we put small wind turbines up? And the students are learning this application in their class. It's not just abstract content, but it's fully integrated application of a practice. So the second way that knowledge is curated, here's the different things you need to know, basically, and here's different things you need to know to apply directly towards sustainability. And then a third area, I think this is probably the most important. David Orr talks a lot about this, is the way that buildings are pedagogical tools, directly or indirectly, or maybe intentionally or unintentionally. We teach a lot of our students how the world works and how the world is by the built environment and the lived experience of being in higher education. And if we don't design that experience, or we're not thinking about that experience as something that's meaningful for students, we're really missing out on opportunities to engage with them around the day-to-day life. Because that's, when you leave, most people will not become sustainability professionals. Everybody will become citizens in some way. And if they don't experience this day-to-day life, sustainability means something to me day-to-day, it's going to be this huge disconnect. In the same way we've made the disconnect between humans and nature, we'll make the disconnect between our activity and the sustainability activity that I do, as a profession. So it's very important, I think, and there's a why to higher ed here, that higher ed is uniquely positioned to orient the lived experience, the day-to-day experience of the students that interact with their campuses all the time. And it's really impingent upon higher ed to do that. And in some ways, that's where the presidential actions or the leadership actions that we're working on can really shape campus and form campus. Hope that makes sense. A couple of good resources. I don't know if anyone's read Michael Crow's new book, William DeBar's Designing the New American University. So it addresses kind of a lot of these fundamentals around the role that universities have historically played and the role they could play. I highly recommend it. Louis Manon, he wrote the Metaphysical Club. Some of you may have been a part of. But again, it relates to the history of higher education and how ideas are generated within higher ed. Super good resources for you. I guess the last thing I didn't mention in this is that oftentimes we think about higher ed progress around the sciences or the natural sciences. And so the disciplines aren't just bringing together an engineer and a chemist or a biologist and somebody who builds turbines or something. But it's actually bringing all the disciplines of campus across the wide suite of what's here. So this includes social sciences in particular, but then also the fine arts and the humanities in different ways. So I think it's these folks actually bring this out in their work. So that's the why. So now let's transition a little bit to where we're headed and where some early thoughts on where the field might be going. We recently updated our mission. I'll just go ahead and read it here to be more specific. So we wanted to say, kind of in the vein of Bill McDonough, we're proactively building a positive global future, so we don't want to do less bad with the future, but we actually think we can do good with the future. And doing three things: initiating bold commitments, so this references the climate commitment that was talked about earlier. Scaling successful actions, so how, now that we have, in our case, a network of 680 plus universities, how can we make sure that things can happen at scale because of the leverage we can provide? And then how can we accelerate innovative solutions? So there's all sorts of great things that are happening in one-off places that are very hard to know unless you had an organization, maybe like ours or like ASHE, like others, who could disseminate that widely, and that could help accelerate those solutions. So those are the three main things that we're focused on. So many of you are probably familiar with this relationship. So we're the ACU PCC, American College University President's Climate Commitment, is arguably one of the premier sustainability initiatives around the country. It's our signature program. So presidents commit their campuses to go climate neutral by a certain date. There's a series of steps they have to do, develop a climate action plan, et cetera. I won't go through all of that. All this to say that it started with about 60 people about 7-8 years ago. And now we've really accelerated that progress. We're about 680, I think the latest numbers oscillates around 687 signatories right now. We represent about 6.5 million students, which is about a third of all of higher ed. Thousands of greenhouse gas inventories have been submitted. Thank you for that. 529 climate action plans. So these climate action plans vary in their complexity. Some are very simple, some are very sophisticated. We are intentionally not prescriptive about how that happened. There's a lot of freedom in the way to do it. What's interesting about it is, given this data, this repository of data, we can start to just know more about how campus operations tend to work according to different Carnegie classes. The thing interesting about here is that you can see, according to scopes of emissions, I think it was in the Yale presentation, and scope 1 and 2 are basically direct emissions and indirect emissions from power, and then scope 3, a big part of it is transportation. And so you see these associate colleges, one of the major challenges people are having now is how, when you have primarily commuter campuses, your emissions can be upwards of 75% due to transportation. And what do you do about that? What are the options you have as a campus? So we can do some of this this data analysis, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. If anybody struggles, so over the course of the past 7 years, we've reduced about 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents from our signatories from this program directly. And that means absolutely nothing to anybody. I mean, it really does not. No one knows what 2 million metric tons means. Unless you go, this is a great site EPA manages, and you can just put in your emissions. So this is 2 million, this is what 2 million metric tons looks like in terms of passenger vehicles, so 420,000 passenger vehicles. It's a much easier way to communicate that out to people using this. So I'd encourage you all to use that as a tool. If you're talking about metric tons, eyes will glaze over. If you're talking about taking cars off the road or gallons of gasoline, that can resonate with people a little bit more. We asked some people, we've surveyed some people, does your climate action plan save you money? 2/3 said yes, 1/4 said no. Just so you know, we make this economic case for folks too. It's not a money suck for 2/3 of the folks. And these are around a few hundred respondents. How much does it save? It's usually in this range of about $1 million or less. So that's the vast majority, but some have really high reported numbers. And then this is kind of a key one. It's really helpful for people to understand that not only do the initiatives on campus directly save us money, but it actually can allow us as a campus to leverage this opportunity and sustainability for outside funding. So we asked people, how much outside funding have you secured? It's over $330 million. So that's a significant number for our signatories. And they come across the range. And I showed earlier there's a wide range of different types of campuses that have signed on to this, including doctorate campuses, which you never knew existed. So, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about maturing the sustainability initiative. And I tried to find the grossest picture that I could. And it's a little bit, it is a little bit, we're in this awkward, a little bit uncomfortable space around what the role of sustainability is in higher education. It's been happening now, you could argue for, a couple decades, and we're being increasingly more sophisticated around the tools that we're using, the initiatives we're taking on, whether you're taxing yourself for carbon or you're putting on a huge large-scale solar operation. What does it look like moving forward? What does maturing our work look like? And I think we have to be honest that it's not always pretty, and it's not always going to be a direct line between what we start out and we think we're going to be successful in and the end point. So one of the things at Second Nature we're committed to is continuing to be out in front of the curve and trying to push our presidents, who are our primary audience, to be this front of the curve thinkers around sustainability. And so, this is the adoption innovation adoption curve, if you want to say, but this first 20% is that's our sweet spot. That's where we want to operate. And it doesn't mean this isn't important. The majority isn't important, but this is our focus area. Another thing we realized for us in maturing is that, let me just take a little bit of time to explain this. So on the left axis would be the percent time that someone has to spend on sustainability. And then on the right, so this would be the green, is the drive needed from external organizations. I just made this up. This isn't really based on, this is more conceptual, but the thinking is that, okay, we deal directly with presidents who, as great people they are, as wonderful, Elsa was here earlier, I think, to give a talk. The percent time that she can possibly dedicate to sustainability is not ever going to be very high by virtue of the position. And so the role that the external organization plays for us, so that's our primary audience, we have to really drive activity amongst our presidents. That's different for deans and faculty who may be environmental deans or environmental directors. There's a part of your time that you can absolutely dedicate to sustainability, but then, oh, by the way, there's students and there's, teaching you have to do, and there's, tenure that you have to consider and all this other stuff. So not all of your time, but a significant chunk of your time is. And so there are other organizations, National Council for Science and the Environment, for the example, that supports directly the deans and directors of environmental programs. And there's a kind of an interesting middle ground there between how much can they drive and how much are they being driven. And then at this far right is probably the groups that many of you are a part of. I would put ASHE here. This idea that there is sustainability professionals that almost 100% of their time is dedicated to figuring this stuff out on their campus. And you are the real leaders. I mean, you're the ones that are here. You're the ones that are doing the work on campuses directly and trying to figure out solutions to problems. And the role of the external organization, my opinion, is just different. It's not better or worse, it's just different. If someone would try to drive your activity in a way that just absolutely did not make sense for your campus, you wouldn't do it because you're the one spending your time doing it. So what the challenge for us is that we need to drive presidents, but then we also need to learn from, in many cases, our implementation liaisons, our sustainability coordinators. So we want to hear back from many of you who are part of signatory institutions on the practices that are happening on your own campuses and the ways that those can be done better. And then we also want to integrate leadership action, which is this presidential commitment, with learning, so knowledge generation and knowledge curation that happens on campus. So that's a direct relationship to these deans and faculty members. So while they're not our primary audience, we definitely work and integrate really well with other people on campus. And hopefully it allows us to complement other organizations better. So we can work together better by understanding where we're coming at this issue. Does that make some kind of sense? Okay. The second thing, well, maybe third thing, another thing we realized was that we are now 8 years into our commitment, and there are varying degrees of stress that go along with where you are in the life cycle of your commitment. So when people are starting out, there's a number of things you have to do, and many people just build up to a greenhouse gas inventory. You have to figure out how to do a greenhouse gas inventory. That involves a lot of data collection. I'm not going to go into it now. Some people are really ready for that, and some people are not. And so one of the things we're doing now is developing a readiness index, so people can know before becoming a signatory or immediately upon becoming a signatory, what are the things I need to have in place in order to be successful with this sort of commitment. Other things, whenever you're 8 years in, maybe your president who originally signed isn't your president anymore. What do you do about that? How are we responsive as Second Nature to the leadership transitions that happen? And this is increasingly going to be, something that we're going to have to communicate out to the people who are working on the ground, because, you're hopefully going to be in your position. If you're a tenured faculty member, you'll be there forever. If you're a sustainability coordinator, you'll be there for a good amount of time, and you want to leave some institutionalization of the initiatives you're working on. So we want to help do that. So there's a bit of understanding the life cycle of the commitment that we're trying to be responsive to. And then we were trying to adopt more of a design thinking approach to prototyping things and piloting things. So we're launching a few smaller scale initiatives with either nonprofit or corporate partners of ours to test things out amongst the membership. It's not something we necessarily have done before explicitly, but this is an explicit thing we're trying. We're going to try to do it. So we're testing out grits. So many of you may have are you all familiar with grits? Some of you? Oh, not many. That's interesting. So this is actually a great tool done by the Sustainable Endowments Institute. It stands for Green Revolving Investment Tracking System. So it allows you to look at projects that you have going on in your campus and look at the opportunity to use green revolving funds to finance those projects. And then it gives you very clean, very slick interface for understanding the paybacks and then how that goes back into starting new projects using that additional capital from the energy savings. So it's a great tool. We're actually piloting this with about 25 minority serving institutions who are part of our network at different stages of the commitment. We're working with a software company called Confluence to look at different levels of sophistication around integrating building management systems and greenhouse gas reporting and climate action planning all together, integrating it all together. Probably people around the room doing a similar thing. We happen to have support from Confluence to do it, so testing that out. We have a couple of scaled solar pilots with these two companies, which are probably two companies you've heard of. Customer First is the integrator that did the American GW project, and I think you're going to hear about that later today. Altinex is another a broker. So we're going to test out what are different ways that these companies engage with university clients around scaled solar opportunities. So we're very careful to make sure that we're getting outcomes that will benefit the entire network, not just that group of people that are part of it, but we are entering into some really interesting pilots over the next 6 months with these groups, these folks. Many of you might be familiar with the Ball State project. Anybody know the voluntary carbon market initiative with Chevy? A few of you. So we've talked to them about follow-up to this. So basically, Chevy said we want to, retire against the environment a bunch of renewable energy credits, and we want higher ed to be a part of that, and the innovative work that's happening in higher ed we want to support. So they supplied capital to 4 universities to sell their RECs. And it's complex because, if you sell your RECs, it doesn't get counted towards carbon reduction goals that you would want to have. But it might enable you to use that capital to do more projects on your campus. There's a specific protocol that's developed as a part of this, and this was, again, piloted with Chevy, about 10 schools. And so we're talking to them about what would it mean to roll this out to the network more broadly, to integrate more into the voluntary carbon market. And now, so that's kind of us as Second Nature. Those are some things we're working on. And then I wanted to end with some maybe more general themes that, words that you've heard of or things you're pushing into. Resilience is a key one. So this is trying to think about how do we adapt in response to the changing world around us, and how do we design our future in response to that. In some ways, you can look at the NYU example as a good case of maybe accidental, maybe intentional infrastructure resilience. So when you look at Sandy, here's an image that shows the microgrid at NYU actually served as a resource for the community in Manhattan. So people could come onto NYU's campus because they had power when no one else did, because they had this smaller microgrid. We're working with the American Association of Community Colleges. We help them with this guide. This is climate resiliency in the community college. One of the things I think we're seeing, and what resilience kind of reflects, is this notion that universities as units are not self-contained units independent of their local context. So for us, resiliency means that you're connecting your campus to community, that you can't become a resilient campus without that discussion happening, without that planning happening. So infrastructure and planning decisions that are taking place on your campus aren't done in independence. So the drive, what we're going to do is actually introduce this resilience commitment that's like a carbon neutral commitment, but it's for resilience, that will reflect that relationship, the relationship between campus and community, and vulnerability and planning, et cetera. A second part of this is, obviously data is a huge, it's just a huge issue right now generally. There's so much of it, right? And the signal and noise problem we're running into all the time. So some of it is big and some of it is little. There's just a lot of data out there. At a first cut, we're starting to have these conversations. We did a session at the National Council for Science and the Environment's annual conference with ASHE and talked about how does basically these 2 major repositories of campus sustainability data, which is our reporting system. We have all these reports throughout the years of mass amounts of data. And then STARS, which many of you are probably participants of STARS, and you submit that. How can these 2 things work together better? Ultimately, in my opinion, the future of reporting is no reporting, so we have just real-time updates, and it takes that whole burden off of people to I got to get my report in. So how can we move to that? So 15 years from now, we're not working off this, one report, and we can actually have dynamic assessment, and we can understand in real time what's going on. I think that in some ways that could be the future, and these conversations are maybe a starting point for making that happen. Lastly, I want to, maybe not lastly, second to lastly, the power of scale. So I'll burn through this a little bit quickly just for sake of time, but this idea of scale is a really interesting one, and we're learning a lot about how campuses could scale activity, and across campuses could scale activity from how cities work. And so many of you might be familiar with Jeffrey West and Louis Betancourt. They've been doing some work around scaling laws in cities. And so what this is showing is that as you increase the size, in this case it's size of a city, and you look at some indicator, that relationship changes depending on what class of indicator you're looking at. Okay, so let me just break this down. If it's a one-to-one relationship, what color is the line going to be? We've got 3 colors. Black. Black is 1-to-1. So that means if you doubled the size of your city, you would double the size of whatever indicator. So population is probably a 1-to-1. You double the size of your city. By definition, you're doubling the size of your population. If you have efficiency or economies of scale, this would be this green line. So this is what you would call sublinear scaling. So that linear is black, sublinear is green. What you find, and what's interesting about their work, is that they demonstrated that this happens across cities, across the globe, with whatever physical indicator you're looking at, generally. So looking at large data sets here. But on average, things scale. You get economies of scale with your physical infrastructure by about 0.85. So what that means is when you double the size of your city, you have an 85% increase, not 100% increase, an 85% increase in your physical infrastructure. Okay, so you have fewer roads per capita if you double the size of your city than if you were in a linear relationship. You have fewer pipes, you have less cables. Anything that's physical tends to follow this relationship. Okay, and there's some real data to support it. So it's kind of a mess at the bottom, but it's a fairly tight relationship as you go up. Across the city, across the globe, same relationship. And then there's this other, in some ways I think a more interesting relationship between the social infrastructure or the social indicators that you find in cities and the size of cities. So when you double the size of the cities and you have an indicator that's 1.13, what would you call superlinear scaling? What does that mean? What's the take home from this graph for this line? Right, so this would be any social indicator, and the 1.13 would be 113% basically. So every time you double the size of the city, you have more than double the size of your social indicator. This would be like GDP, number of patents, amount of innovation, actually pace of life, like people move faster, not just twice as fast, but 1.13 times as fast. And bad things too, like disease transmission, all these things, positive and negative, happen whenever you relate this size. And it's fairly consistent. It's about a 13% premium. So what does this mean for us? And there's some real data on social measures. What does it mean for us as campuses as we grow bigger or we collectively scale our activity? One is that we can get more efficiency, maybe in price, around the larger installations we do. So this is the American example that you'll hear something about. You can get efficiencies for physical stuff. I'm not exactly sure what it means for the social stuff, what we learn about that. But I think there's something to gathering together in larger groups around innovation that could be really interesting, to think about things like this. Could be a really important, meaningful, progressive time for all your universities, not because you're part of this larger, system, you help the system, but you actually help yourselves from being here. You'll get more innovation happening faster whenever you have larger convenings of people. That potentially could be an outcome. I'm not exactly sure if that's true or not. But if we learn anything from the city stuff, it could be that. It could be that we could get more innovation by more convenings of ourselves together. So we have power of scale and then power of network. And so I'll just mention this quickly. So I'm standing between you and lunch. So this is an image of all the plane airline travel throughout the world. And do you know how much you need to know about this network in order to understand the characteristics of it? Any guesses? What % of the connections in this network do you need to know? 5%? Yeah, so 6%. If you know 6% of this, you can explain pretty much anything about this network. So it's really helpful to think about, we don't have to know all the details of everything that's happening, and it's really helpful to think about, how can I be part of that 6%? And if I'm part of this network of 680 plus schools, how do I be one of those key nodes that creates something special. Maybe it's, a northeastern connection that in New England states, this sort of convening can really be a catalyst that drives how this sort of thing happens every year. So how can you become part of the 6%? I think that's a good question to ask. And I end most of my talks with this quote because it's one of my favorites. So Buckminster Fuller, he said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So we're not talking about incremental change, really. We're talking about second order change. In some ways, I think we could argue the ACPCC actually was a new model that made climate leadership at a presidential level, in some ways obsolete. And so I would, again, ask yourself this same question. What are the new models that you're building on your own campuses that can really change the paradigm around this? So there's my contact information. Feel free to be in touch. Again, thanks for the organizers of this for inviting me. And I think she's going to tell us about lunch, which is more exciting than this stuff. Thank you.